Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another Thursday evening on the Disc Connected. We're here with somebody that I respect and admire quite a bit, Mr. Troy Howarth, tonight. Troy, thanks for volunteering to do this.
Thank you for having me.
Got Klaus over his shoulder and ready to hang out. We're going to be talking about Peter Cushing tonight. Just a little bit of a lean. I have found that I don't explain this before we get started enough. So if it's somebody's first time here, just so you're aware, we're going to go over some random hangout time for a little bit, talk about some recent pickups, what we've watched, go into all of the physical media announcements for the week, and then we have a long discussion tonight. It's going to be a discussion on Peter Cushing. And like many of you probably, I am on the lighter side of knowledge on Peter Cushing. So I'm going to rely on Troy tonight. Troy, are you ready to be a tour guide for me?
I'll just make it up and hope that nobody calls me out for it.
Well, I imagine, knowing what we both know, that wouldn't be the first time.
Well, true.
We have something to highlight for Mr. Cushing. He just recently had a pretty incredible looking release from Severin that just came out called Cushing's Curiosities, and I unfortunately don't have it yet. I'm dying to get this one. Same with that Danza Macabra Volume 2, and they're doing a lot with some of these box sets, so I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't have the Danza Macabre set yet. I'm sure I will at some point, but I do have Cushing Curiosities, and very pleased I am with it.
I am excited to hear more about it and hear all of the knowledge that you can impart on us. Speaking of physical things, any recent pickups that you would like to share with the group?
Well, there are a few, but I figured I would just grab and show off this little toy here, the
Yes.
Coffin Joe box set from Arrow. Collection of films by Jose Mojica Marins. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If I'm not, I apologize. I'm not conversant in the language, but as far as I know, that's correct. And yeah, that's a really amazing box set. These are films, some of which have never really been presented properly on video before. As I'm sure you remember, Synapse put out some of the films in the US a long time ago on DVD. So these are long overdue upgrades with all kinds of new special features. And apparently, I've not dug into it yet, but the remastering on the films is pretty mind blowing. So good stuff.
For those that haven't heard yet, I haven't posted anything about it. We weren't going to talk about it in news, but should highlight here. There's likely going to be a disc replacement for one of the discs in this. There's one of the films, the captions stop at 33 minutes in, and for some reason they're just not existent for the rest of the film. So I'm sure they're going to have to replace that. It's not in English, and yeah, they'll get that out to everybody soon, I'm sure. And Arrow's usually pretty good about that, so we will. I'm sure here in the next 1 or 2 weeks about that, since it's happening for everybody.
Well, it happens. Even Paramount put out a 4K of Rosemary's Baby recently, and they had to do a replacement because there was a line of dialogue that Ralph Bellamy says late in the film that I was watching it. I thought, wait a second, I know this movie very well. Where's that line? And then sure enough, I saw there was a replacement program, which I already got my replacement, and the line is back. So that's good.
That's very fast for a studio, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Couple things for me. I finally got in Weird, the Al Yankovic story on 4K. This is the Shout release. Wanted this since it got announced. Love Weird Al. Been to one of its concerts. Have you ever been into Weird Al? I'm sure somebody of your age were quite some time with him.
Yeah, a little bit. Not a fanatic, but I definitely am familiar and have enjoyed some of it. Never had the opportunity to see him live though.
It is a blast, and he puts on a hell of a show. The other big one I got in Second Sight's massive release of Mean Streets. This is the 4K box set that just came out. Chose this over Criterion. I just generally prefer Second Sight's output. And then the big one for me, Suitable Flesh. This is the newest one from Joe Lynch, and should take the time here to tell everybody that's not in the Patreon. Patreon got the chance to input questions if they had it, but I was able to interview the director, Mr. Joe Lynch himself, this week, and that'll be up on the channel in the next few weeks. And It is a really good one. The dude has some incredible talent, and it felt like a very passing of the torch moment from the Lovecraft worship area of the mid '80s to the early '90s with Stuart Gordon going over to Joe Lynch, and really loved it. We got a question to show the spine of Mean Streets to see how thick it is. It's a pretty big release. It's not as big as Drive or anything like that, but it's a big release for sure. Any recent watches that are not part of your work that you want to be able to talk about?
Well, I made my way through the massive sensual world of Black Emmanuel from Severin.
You mean that one?
Which was, it was quite the journey, and I have to say it was a fascinating experience. I can't say I liked all the films, but I liked most of them. And was very happy to have them all gathered together. I mean, there are only so many of them that are like quote unquote legitimate Black Manuel films, and there's a bunch of kind of adjacent titles. But it's fun to have them. There were a couple that kind of had me wanting to slit a wrist trying to make my way through them, but by and large I was very pleased. They're a lot of fun to watch, and I would highly recommend that set to anybody that's curious. You're going to be sucked in for quite some time with that one.
I agree. I still think this is one of the easily like the most ambitious box sets ever created. I mean, the fact that we got that many rights holders to negotiate and be able to come together in something so ambitious like this is just impressive. Severin, like there's something special happening there.
Yeah. No, they do a lot of good work, and also I watched their release of Della Morte Dell'Amore recently, and also their release of Last Horror Film with Joe Spinell, and again, fine releases. I mean, I did kind of find myself wondering as I was watching Last Horror Film, did this really need to be on 4K? I'm not altogether sure about that, given the visual quality of the film, but it looks as good as it ever can, and it's got a lot of good stuff extras wise, and it's lovingly produced, so that's nice. And Della Morte Dell'Amore was just gorgeous, of course. I really finally got the release it deserved.
Comment, I guess, for you from Brendan. Just want to say, while you're here, thank you, Troy. Learned so much about genre film from your book since diving into it a few years ago.
Thank you. It's always nice to hear that people are appreciating and enjoying my efforts.
And there are many efforts. If you have never checked out Troy's stuff, please go out there. Many of them are still available on Amazon, still fairly inexpensive, and the amount of information in them can be overwhelming. So it is very much worth your pennies that you can throw at it. Recent watches for me, a couple things for some projects that I'm working on. I spent a lot of time with the one that Mr. Craig from Deaf Crocodile announced here just a couple weeks ago. Kin Ditza. I'm going to say it on that way on purpose because Will and I have been joking about the title for a little bit. We just did a visual essay for that one, so I feel like I've been living in Russia for the last week. It is a glorious film, and when that finally comes out, I think you all will really appreciate it. That movie is magnificent. Let's see. Comment on the last horror film. Watching that 4K, I felt like I was physically transported to 1981 at the Cannes Film Festival.
Yeah, it is the only horror film that Marcello Mastroianni was ever in, and he didn't even know he was in it.
Derek says Scarecrow videos, a Mecca film, unbelievable selection. I've been there many times. Do support Scarecrow, buy a shirt. Derek is talking about the fact that I'm wearing a Scarecrow video shirt tonight in Seattle. Go support them, please. They're amazing people. But yeah, not many other recent watches for me. And speaking of Christopher Lee, now that we're done with announcements, it's time to discuss a collaborator of Mr. Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, which I've seen some from, but nowhere near enough. So I'm eager to hold your hand and to dive into this filmography because it's for actors like Cushing and Christopher Lee and some of the other big ones that were kind of all over the map and got big and lasted for quite some time. It's hard to be, if you want to do it the right way and really dive in a way where you're not turned off at first, it's hard to know where to start, hard to know what were the big ones that were appreciated, what are the fun ones that are underrated. So first off, an intro to Mr. Cushing. What can you share with us?
Oh, where to begin? I mean, he was an actor who got his start in films, actually in Hollywood in 1939. He went out to Hollywood in order to try and get a career going in films. Very first film he was in was Man in the Iron Mask, directed by James Whale, which is funny because nearly 20 years later, he finds himself starring in a film, Curse of Frankenstein, which is often described erroneously, but is often described as a remake of James Whale's Frankenstein from 1931. It's a very different interpretation of Mary Shelley's book, of course. But funnily enough, yes, his very first job out the gate was being directed by James Whale, who also directed him in another film. And I think it was actually Whale's last completed feature film called They Dare Not Love a couple years later. During this period of time, he also did a small role in a Laurel and Hardy comedy called Chump at Oxford, which is certainly well worth seeing if you haven't seen it. I love Laurel and Hardy myself. I think they're kind of timeless. Their comedies are still very, very funny, and it's funny seeing him acting opposite them. But like a lot of Englishmen abroad during that time, the war came about. He decided to go back and try to pitch into the war effort. Didn't get anywhere with that because he had some injuries when he was a younger man, in playing football and so forth. So he got involved in the kind of morale boosting, the ENSA part of the entertainment industry, where they kind of get together and entertain the troops with performances and so forth. He became a big star in the 1950s on television. He was a huge, huge star on British television. Um, I mean, really impossible to overstate his popularity at that time. In particular, did a version of 1984, which was adapted by Nigel Neal, a name that might be familiar to some of you. Obviously, he was the man responsible for writing the Quatermass stories that were made originally as TV plays for the BBC. Then Hammer made versions in the 50s and 60s as well. He was also involved in the writing of Halloween 3, Season of the Witch, although he took his name off it because he wasn't happy with the results. And he did this version for TV of 1984 that was so shocking in its time. It caused an incredible amount of controversy. It has happily survived, not in the best version, because the original broadcast version that was put out, that Cushing always said was much better, was not the version that was kept, was not the version that was recorded. It was a repeat performance. But we're lucky that we have it all together, because most of the TV stuff that was put out at that time, basically the BBC would just tape them over. Tapes were expensive. It wasn't practical to keep everything that was being broadcast. So there's huge chunks of television history that were just taped over because nobody thought it was important. So unfortunately, a lot of that stuff is gone, including a lot of interesting stuff that Cushing did even into the 1960s. He did an Asimov adaptation of The Caves of Steel, for example, which doesn't exist anymore. Well, I think there's like a clip that's floating around, which gives one hope that maybe somewhere, maybe the full version exists. But he became a huge, huge star in British television, and also he worked in big films, but in small parts. So he's in Moulin Rouge, for example, the John Huston film. I emphasize, not the one with Nicole Kidman. And he plays
Although
a small part in that.
that would have been fantastic to see Cushing in a Baz Luhrmann film.
Well, not just Cushing, because Christopher Lee is also in it. Right. They're before they're even connected in terms of doing horror films together. They both appear in this movie by John Huston, which is based on the real life story of Toulouse-Lautrec, obviously made into a very melodramatic kind of soap opera in many respects, but a beautiful looking movie. And he's pretty much all over the map, doing all kinds of different films in the 1950s. But then The Curse of Frankenstein, he's offered the role of Baron Frankenstein in this new color adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And in the process, the movie becomes a huge hit. It is enormously successful across the globe. It's the first kind of color Gothic horror film of its vintage. After a break in Gothic horror, which had kind of fallen out of fashion, got into the Abbott and Costello type parodies, and then it was the era of science fiction, big bug monster movies, things like that, Godzilla, all that sort of thing was the rage for a period of time. But Curse of Frankenstein proved that audiences could still be interested in and indeed drawn to Gothic horror. So it kicked off a whole new revolution, which ultimately, kind of expanded into other countries, including Italy, France, etc. But Curse of Frankenstein was the big one that kind of got the ball rolling. And in doing that film, Cushing became identified very strongly with horror films. And for a period of time, I think it's true to say he kind of bucked against that a little bit. He was a little bit uncomfortable with that. He didn't want to be typecast, but eventually settled into it and did a whole slew of horror films throughout the 60s, 70s, into the early 80s. So I mean, there's a lot to cover. I mean, in terms of which films are most interesting. I don't know if you have any particular areas that you're more keen in talking about than others, but that's kind of the very generic initial overview of who Cushing was. Let's not forget too, also stage actor. He had worked with Laurence Olivier. He's in Laurence Olivier's film of Hamlet, played the role of Osric, which was played by Robin Williams in the Kenneth Branagh version many, many years later. Christopher Lee, also in that film, funnily enough, in an unbilled, kind of stolen cameo appearance. He claimed that he sort of snuck onto the set and donned some armor and played a character very much in the background. So nobody even knew that he was there, including Olivier apparently. But that was their first kind of film together, even though they didn't meet at that time. But it's funny how often their careers kind of intersected and how many times they ended up working together because they played off each other very, very well.
My big Cushing is one that we could probably talk for lengths about, is The Curse of Frankenstein. It's already been talked about quite a bit, but I love a lot of the Hammer titles, and that one obviously sticks out as a really, really important title. Considering he was born in I think 1913 or 14, somewhere around there,
1913.
and then he passed in what, 95, 94?
He died in 94, which I'll never forget for a couple of reasons. One is back in 1986 on Turner, what used to be called WTBS, it's now just called TBS. They used to have a program on, I don't know if it was Saturday mornings or Sunday mornings, probably Saturday mornings, where a local kind of film critic named Bill Tush hosted movies, and they ran Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. And when the film was over, Bill Tush came back and said, that this screening was dedicated to Peter Cushing, who had passed away earlier that year. I was 9 years old, and Peter Cushing was already one of my favorites and one of my sort of childhood heroes. And I was very sad to hear this. Oh, it was terrible. And only to realize then a couple of years later, he's still alive. I had no idea. So he was back from the dead, only then to discover in 1994 in August. I remember being, it was a nice sunny day, and I was getting ready to go out with a friend, and my dad called me into the living room, said, "Hey, Troy, come out and look." And as soon as I came out, I knew it was bad, because on the Channel 4 news, there was a clip of the end of the original Hammer Dracula. And I thought, oh boy, one of them's dead. And it was Peter Cushing, had passed away finally. So I had to mourn him twice, so to speak.
That seems apt for somebody like Cushing, who had a few comebacks and lots of different eras of his life dedicated to different types of films. Do you remember the first Cushing film that you got to see?
I was afraid you were going to ask me that. I hear people sometimes talking about, I remember seeing this movie when I was 2 years old or 3 years old, and I think, you're full of shit. Nobody remembers that far back. I can go back at least to 1982 when I was 5 years old, and I can remember being excited to see certain films at that time. I can't swear to anything before that. They're all kind of muddled together, and honest to God, I can tell you that from the time I was just a very small child, I have very vivid memories of being a fan of Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi, Basil Rathbone. So I don't have a particular one that I can say this was the one. I don't remember that. I would say it might have been maybe The Mummy. It might have been Dracula AD 1972. It could have been Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. I'm not entirely sure. I know I saw those ones when I was very, very young.
Is there a film that maybe not one that he necessarily said was his best, but that you look at and say, this is like the perfect Cushing performance?
I I think his finest film work, obviously I can't assess his theater work for obvious reasons, and television is a different thing, and there's a lot of work there that's gone we can't see. But I think his best film work was Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, largely because it takes the Cushing persona and subverts it in such an interesting way, kind of similar to what Vincent Price does in Witchfinder General, where you take this image of the perfect Victorian gentleman with impeccable manners, very much a dandy, never a hair out of place, immaculately dressed and everything else, and just turns him into a thoroughgoing bastard. Now he is terrible, not terrible in his acting, but terrible as a character in The Curse of Frankenstein as well. And it's funny because a lot of people, because they love Cushing so much, they tend to act as if he was always such a lovable character on screen. Actually, played quite a few villains.
Yeah.
And Cushing himself, I don't know if he always said this or if it was in later years when he kind of became very sort of spiritual and very religious. He always tried to act as if Baron Frankenstein was this kind of progressive, kind of a medical pioneer, and he was in it for the good of humanity. It really wasn't. I mean, for the most part, and a couple of the Frankenstein films try to regard these films as a continuity is impossible. They don't link together for the most part. There are some that do, but if you try and look at them all as a continuous, it doesn't work at all. So there are a couple where he's more heroic than others. But in other ones, he's really nasty. He was nasty in Curse of Frankenstein. He's even nastier in Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. He is remarkably unpleasant in that movie, but he has so many brilliant scenes in that. Especially, there's a great scene where he's in sort of disguise. He's changed his name and he's on the run from the authorities, and he overhears some stuffed shirts that are staying in the same place that he's staying at, same boarding house, talking about him, not realizing he's in the room, and then he just proceeds to eviscerate them verbally without even raising his voice. It's an amazing scene, very, very funny, but also just, again, an indicator of what an absolutely brilliant actor he was.
It's been, we've been talking about this for almost 15 minutes, and nobody said the word Star Wars yet, which is a good thing. But it's obviously that's probably the film that he's been in that's been seen by the most people, most likely. Other than Star Wars, what do you think he made the biggest impact with? What do you think is his output that the most people, had something personal attached to it?
Well, I mean, Star Wars is obviously the big one, which, funnily enough, did nothing for his career. I think there are reasons for that, but I mean, if you look at his filmography after that, it didn't do anything for him.
Yeah.
Honestly, which is kind of surprising in some respects. Curse of Frankenstein, in terms of his film work, undoubtedly was the big one, no question about that. And in terms of his reputation in Great Britain as a number one TV draw, like seriously, people would leave the pubs and go home early to watch TV if they heard Peter Cushing was in a play. Would be 1984, which was a very, very big deal at that time.
And one of the other things that he was known for is he had a lot of great co-stars. Obviously, we talked about with Christopher Lee and some other big names that he played with multiple times.
Yeah.
Which do you think was maybe his best pairing? Was it Christopher Lee, or is there somebody else that you love to see him with?
Oh, Lee, without a doubt. I mean, he worked with Vincent Price a couple of times, but no, Christopher Lee was the perfect. They just complemented each other beautifully because they're very different actors. Cushing was very fussy. He had a lot of mannerisms that you could always count on. It's the finger and slicking back his hair in moments of stress, rubbing his foot. He did these. He was a very busy actor. Christopher Lee was very still, very minimalist. Christopher Lee was a pure film actor, which I think means that his performances in general tend to be more naturalistic, whereas Cushing was a theater actor. So sometimes he needed to be reined in a little bit. He could be slightly theatrical. But they just, he was very jittery, very nervous, always constantly moving around, notorious for always fiddling with props, always bringing props into scenes, whereas Lee was very still. But whenever he would leap into action, it had that much more impact because he was kind of conserving it. So they worked beautifully together. They got along very well too. They were friends. They weren't best friends in the way that some people make it out to be. Like, they didn't go to barbecues together. They didn't hang out in each other's basements and shoot the breeze. But they were friends. They had mutual respect for each other and certainly worked together on a number of films. I mean, again, going all the way back to accidental pairings in things like Hamlet, Moulin Rouge. through all these films that went through the, well, really into the, well, technically even the 90s, because the last thing Cushing did was co-recording a narration for Flesh and Blood, a documentary about Hammer, which he and Christopher Lee narrated. It was the last thing Cushing did. He was literally dying when he did that, in very, very bad shape. So, but in terms of films, all the films at Hammer, all the stuff at Amicus, things like The House of Drip Blood, oddball films like Scream and Scream Again, which I'm very fond of. And their last kind of big screen kind of jaunt, also bringing in Vincent Price and John Carradine, House of Long Shadows.
That was House of Long Shadows, and one more that I was going to bring up. What do you think of Horror Express?
That's my favorite of their pairings. I don't think it's a better film or even as good a film as like the original Dracula or The Mummy, for example. But in terms of, it's the best example of them playing off each other. It's the only film that really gives them an opportunity the whole way through to really play off each other.
Yes.
It's so much fun. They're on the same side, but they're kind of antagonistic towards each other at first. It's, again, taking Christopher Lee's image as being sort of slightly stuffy and pompous and humorless and everything, and turning it on his head so that he's very sort of frigid and unapproachable and unsympathetic at first, but then he becomes a full-fledged like action hero at the end. He's fantastic in that film. And Cushing is just so much fun with his impish sense of humor and so forth. It's tremendously entertaining. I could watch that movie every year for the rest of my life.
I'm so glad you agree. This is one that I wouldn't say it's like an exploited title on home video, but it's one.
Shit.
Is the phone about to die? What happened? Anyways, I'll continue on Horror Express while we try to find Troy again. Don't know what just happened. Horror Express is one that's not been like exploited on home video, but it has lots of releases. So I feel like a lot of people have had a chance to be able to watch those. If you've not seen Horror Express, you can get it. I believe Arrow even had a release quite a few years ago, and then there was Scorpion or somebody else that put it out in the US. It's definitely been out there. The big thing that Troy and I are going to talk about in just a moment when we get Troy back is the recent Severin release of Cushing Curiosities. This is a 6-disc box set that is now shipping. This one just started coming out fairly recently. I think people have been getting this in for like a month now. I think this was shipping right after the Black Friday sale. And there is a lot in this. There are 5 feature films, 6 of the BBC teleplays that Troy was just talking about, a 200-page book, and 16 plus hours of special features. There are commentaries on almost everything. There is a lot of love in this with it doesn't look like Emmanuel is taking a photo of Ryan. Jeez. A lot of love in this with Kevin Lyons and Jonathan Rigby. That's the other name I was looking for. And we also have the Sherlock Holmes release in this. Is supposed to be great. I don't have this one in yet, but I'm eager to get it. There's Troy again. Hello.
I apologize. I was using my phone and I did not realize we were going to have such a long pre-game, and my phone ended up dying on me. So
you're okay. It was really funny timing because I heard shit and then it was like falling from your face and then it died.
No, I knew it was coming. I just I had no way to prevent it from happening.
Well, Cushing Curiosities in this, I just started talking about it to waste a little time before you come back. In this, we've got Cone of Silence from 1960. We've got Suspect from 1960 and The Man Who Finally Died from 62. 3 and 4 are Sherlock Holmes discs. And then 5 is Bloodsuckers from 1971. And then finally 6 is Tender Dracula from 74. What can you tell us about any of these and anything else about the box set that you want to rave about?
Well, I think the big thing I'd like to rave about is the book. You can't even call it a booklet. I mean, that's inaccurate. It's a book that Jonathan Rigby put together, which is fantastic. And I would say it's the best thing that's been written about Peter Cushing thus far. Most of the biographies all of the biographies that have been written about him fall into this trap of kind of trying to make him into St. Peter. He was, by all accounts, a lovely guy and extremely extremely professional and everything, but he had his quirks and he had his flaws, and there were things that, kind of go against the image of his sort of squeaky clean image. And Jonathan Rigby kind of wrestles with the peculiarities of his personality in this book. This is a man who in many respects was kind of a Peter Pan in many respects. He was a little bit of a child in some regards, and not exactly always as squeaky clean as some people make him out to be. Not to take anything away from him, that's just reality of what he is. And kind of trying to analyze, why his career went the way that it did and why he didn't have more success in certain areas, and, and so forth and so on. So it's a wonderful, wonderful addition. I mean, it could be released on its own, it'd be fantastic. I'd love to see a proper biography written of him by somebody like either Jonathan Rigby or somebody who's willing to take it on seriously and honestly like that. So that would be the first thing I'd say. The other thing is that all these films, they're not on the same tier. They're not all the same quality, but I'm just so glad to see them all released. Cone of Silence is a really good movie with a very good cast. You've got George Sanders, Andre Morel, Michael Craig, Charles Tingwell, Noel Willman, lots of really familiar faces, especially if you're into the Hammer films. You're going to recognize a lot of these actors. And I would say he explores Cushing's Curiosities. It's a really good, and Bernard Lee, too, who was M in the James Bond films for many years. It's a really good sort of suspense drama, and Cushing plays a thoroughly unpleasant character in it. So another example of him not always being the nice guy on screen. Suspect is a great movie. It's a little B movie, a little sort of cheap thing that the Bolting brothers threw together, to sort of demonstrate the ability to make a low budget programmer with high quality. So you've got Peter Cushing, Donald Pleasance, Ian Bannon, who steals the show, and lots of really good actors in that film, and a really gripping narrative. It even has the British comedian Spike Milligan in it as well. He has some amusing bits in that film. And Thorley Walters, who's a familiar face from a lot of Hammer films, he's in it too. So that one I recommend very highly. The Man Who Finally Died is not as good. It's a little bit, I think it's a little dry. It's a little dull, but it does have some good things. And it's, again, a great cast headed by Stanley Baker, who was a big star. He's a Welsh actor. He's a big star back in the 60s. He's somewhat forgotten now, I think largely because he died rather young. But people who are into genre films might remember him for playing the sarcastic police inspector in Lucio Fulci's Lizard in a Woman's Skin, amongst other things. But I mean, obviously big films like Zulu and Guns of Navarone and so forth. So film isn't quite the sum of its parts, but it's worth looking at. The Sherlock Holmes series is interesting because these are the surviving episodes as well as excerpts of some shows that haven't survived, but there are clips of them available. Famously, Cushing, well, we should say, first of all, he played Sherlock Holmes in 1958 for Hammer in a version of Hound of the Baskervilles. It has often been said that the film was a commercial failure and that this killed a series of Sherlock Holmes films that Hammer was going to make. That neither of these things are true. First of all, the film was successful. It wasn't as successful as Curse of Frankenstein or Dracula or Revenge of Frankenstein, but it made money. But they never intended to make a series of Sherlock Holmes films. That wasn't part of their agenda. They just thought, Hound of the Baskervilles, Gothic, this fits into what we're doing at this time, we'll do one. I'm sure if it had been a bigger hit, they might have looked into doing more, but it wasn't really up to them because they didn't control the rights to the stories at that time. And the estate was not happy with the film, apparently, because they thought it was too violent. So I think that was going to happen regardless. Anyway, a decade later, he takes over from an actor named Douglas Wilmer, who has been playing Sherlock Holmes on TV back in 1965. He had a miserable experience making the series, and Cushing similarly had a miserable experience because he'd been promised all kinds of rehearsal time and opportunities to do things properly, and the whole thing was just chaos. It was a very, ill-prepared, and Cushing always said, I don't see myself doing my best work in this series. I see an actor who's just desperately trying to spit his lines out without screwing them up. And as a matter of fact, he does flub a few, which tells you something. He was an immaculate actor, but given the way that the series was put together, it's not surprising that it's a little rough around the edges. if this were Cushing's only kind of go at Sherlock Holmes, I wouldn't say that he would rank as one of my favorites in the character. He's fine in the series, but it's not his best work. His work in The Hound of the Baskervilles for Hammer, on the other hand, is fantastic. It really kind of paves the way for what Jeremy Brett did later on in the 80s and 90s with his portrayal of Holmes, which is fairly definitive. So these are interesting curiosities. They're a little rough around the edges, but, you know, they're well worth taking a look at. Speaking of rough around the edges, Bloodsuckers. Yeah. Well, it's got a 10-minute orgy sequence in it. Cushing's not in the orgy sequence, I hasten to add. The most shocking thing you're ever going to see Cushing do on film is in a movie he did from 60. Well, he shot in 67. It came out in 68 called Corruption, where there's a continental version, which is on the Blu-ray versions, where he wrestles around with a naked prostitute and spreads stage blood all over her exposed breasts. You know, many Cushing fans needed their fainting couches for that one. The gentlemen are doing such a thing. Bloodsuckers is a really weird film. It's a mess. It's not surprising it's a mess because it really wasn't finished. It was a troubled production. There are a lot of stories about it. A lot of things have been said that the money ran out, and other people have denied that this is true. But ultimately, what we've got is a movie that is in sorely unfinished condition. So the whole first third of the movie is very choppy, makes it very difficult to get into. It's an absolute mess up front, but if you stick with it, it gets better as it goes on. It's got some interesting stuff in it. Cushing doesn't have a lot to do, but he's got a great scene at the end, which is definitely well worth seeing. And it's got a great cameo by Edward Woodward, who is fantastic as a sort of expert on vampirism. He's got some very funny lines, and it's almost worth watching just for him. It's an interesting film. It's never looked this good before. I can tell you the release that Severin put together for this is pretty extraordinary. And it's got a great commentary by Jonathan Rigby and Kevin Lyons, who, again, I aspire to that level of quality of what they do and what they bring to these releases. So it's a great example of taking a movie that has suffered a lot in terms of being badly regarded down through the years and being put together now in an edition that at least makes it possible to appreciate it and see what it was trying to do.
I love that as they introduce this, they say it can be reevaluated as the longest version ever assembled. Obviously, they skirt around. Is it complete? No, because it never was.
Not really, no, but it is the longest version because that orgy scene I mentioned was cut, which, let's be honest, was for the best. But, you know, it's there now, and it does make it, I believe, the only Peter Cushing film with full frontal nudity. Again, with the Cushing finger, not from the man himself, though. Tender Dracula. Yeah, that's an oddball film too, which I appreciate more now. Actually, having seen this beautiful Blu-ray presentation, it's a movie that's it's a little misleading. There's a question as to whether, you know, is he actually even a vampire in the film? It's unclear. We can interpret it as he's a real vampire, or he may not be. He's just a crackpot horror film star who identifies too closely with his role. The film has some interesting kind of meta kind of flourishes, which almost in a way kind of makes it comparable for him to, say, like Theater of Blood for Vincent Price, where it's almost a little bit of celebration of Cushing the actor in terms of, you know, we see the character McGregor, who he plays as a horror film star, and he's got scrapbooks with photos. We can see pictures of Cushing at various different stages in his career and so forth. He has some lovely scenes in the film with Alida Valli, a wonderful Italian actress who had been in The Third Man, but also in things like Lisa and the Devil and Suspiria. And their scenes are really, really good. But there's also a lot of other sort of French farce material with other actors, which isn't nearly as interesting or engaging. But if you watch the film, this is one of those ones where you kind of want to toggle back and forth. The Cushing Valley scenes, watch them in English because it's got their voices. But the other scenes with the French actors, you're probably better off watching those scenes in French. They're still not very funny, but at least they're better than the English language dubs on those actors.
Interesting. And again, Troy just brought up Jonathan Rigby and Kevin Lyons, but they are literally all over the set. Jonathan Rigby especially is one that I always like listening to, not to take away from Kevin Lyons. Just something about Jonathan Rigby is just magnetic and just so educational. I'm dying to see stuff from the set. I definitely need to pick it up eventually.
Yeah, it's well worth buying. It's worth it. I mean, again, what did they have it marked down to $95? That's a good deal for what you're getting with all those films and plus that book. I mean, it's really beautifully put together. So it has my highest recommendation.
The crazy thing is, I think the release from Amazon comes with the book as well, and the link for that's in the description below. It's even cheaper on Amazon. It's like $72 right now. That's a damn good deal. So I would check that out. Link is in the description. Cushing has done so much over the years. Two like what if questions for you. We talked about who was your favorite that he was with. Who did he never star with that you would have loved to have seen him do something with from around that time?
Surprisingly, never crossed paths professionally, and I don't even know if personally, with Boris Karloff. I would have liked to have seen that. Basil Rathbone very nearly happened, which would have been wonderful. We would have had two of the very best Sherlock Holmeses. Well, the two best Sherlock Holmeses of the big screen up until that time. They were supposed to be in a movie together called The Blood Beast Terror, which is the infamous killer moth movie, giant killer moth movie, which is better than you might think based on that description, or maybe not as good either, depending on your point of view. Basil Rathbone was supposed to have played the mad scientist in that film, but unfortunately he passed away. He had just come back from doing a very strange film in Mexico with Cameron Mitchell and John Carradine called Autopsy for a Ghost. Apparently the altitude in Mexico didn't agree with him, and he died of a heart attack quite suddenly. I think he was 75, which is not, it's not that old. So he was gearing up to do this movie in England with Peter Cushing, and that would have been a joy to have seen that. So either one of those guys, I would have loved to have seen him sharing a screen with them.
Other than characters, is there a role that he didn't ever get to play, or a type of role that he never played that you feel like he would have been really great at?
I think it would have been interesting to have seen him in the James Bond universe in some capacity. I think he could have played a villain very effectively. If we look at the films, what villain would he have been good for? The only one that I can think of that, certainly he could have done and was, took place during his time when he was still active and so forth. He would have been good as Stromberg in The Spy Who Loved Me. I think he would have been good for that. Not to take anything away from Kurt Jurgens, he was great, but I think Cushing would have been, or alternatively, after Bernard Lee stepped down as M, he would have been a good M as well. So I think in something like that, that would have been interesting. I would have liked to have seen him doing something like that. It's pretty well known that he turned out, his agent turned down Halloween. He was offered the role of Dr. Loomis. I only just saw this recently. Somebody was saying, he turned it down. He couldn't do it because he was working on Star Wars. Star Wars was shot 2 years before Halloween. He shot his scenes, I believe, in a week, all of a week in May of 1976, I believe. Halloween was shot in the spring of 1978. So I think he could have slotted it in. But his agent thought that the film wasn't worthy of his time. I think if Cushing would have gotten the offer directly, he probably would have done it. And he would have been good. I mean, I have no reason to doubt that he would have been good, but his health would have only permitted him to have done the first film and the second film. He wouldn't have been available for the later ones. Christopher Lee did turn it down because he really was trying to get away from that type of film. Right. He did apparently tell Deborah Hill, the producer, at a function, I think for Escape from New York, that it was a mistake. But he may have just been saying that to be nice, because honestly, I don't think he really wanted to get typecast again in horror films. And that's exactly what happened to Donald Pleasence after that. So the right guy got the part, though.
Yeah, Donald Pleasence certainly embraced it after that.
Well, I mean, he was what the English call a jobbing actor, as were Cushing and Lee. If the opportunity was there, if they could slot it into the schedule, they were happy to do it. They just love to work and go places and work on films. I mean, the thing about Cushing was how quintessentially English he was, and that he was very much unlike Christopher Lee, and indeed unlike Donald Pleasence. He was, reluctant to travel outside of England for years. That changed after his wife died in 1971, and he went into a complete sort of nervous breakdown very publicly. Talked about being suicidal and everything else, which didn't do his career any good. I can assure you. I think that made a lot of people reluctant to hire him. I think that connects into some of the issues he had later on in his career in terms of not getting bigger offers. I mean, Jonathan Rigby's talked about this as well, and other people have as well. I mean, this is pretty common knowledge that he suffered terribly after her death, and he kind of went into this real kind of deeply spiritual period, and he was very religious and so forth, which he never seemed to be prior to that. But during that period of time, it seemed as though because he was just so desperately unhappy, he was willing to go wherever. So he started doing films he did a horror film in Florida called Shockwaves, for example. He famously broke a tooth on the flight on his way to do that film. Didn't want to do anything about it until he got back to England so he could see his own dentist. And the only thing he was really concerned about was getting a stack of buckwheats at the International House of Pancakes. So, he was only too happy to go and do that. He did a film in Greece with Donald Pleasence called Land of the Minotaur or The Devil's Men, which is a pretty terrible film, but he went to Germany and all these different places. But before his wife's death, he didn't really do that too much. He tended to stick pretty close to home. And so he made him the most, I think, quintessentially English of all the horror film stars.
And English proper indeed. A lot of his mannerisms, it feels very like somebody that would be called Lord or something back then. You mentioned his hair earlier. The way that he always caressed it just screamed English to me.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, and of course it's true to say too, and obviously I speak from experience. He wore a wig or a hairpiece in a great many films going back to the 19th, as indeed did Christopher Lee. Lee never acknowledged that. He tried to keep that secret, I think. But Cushing, would sometimes appear in films without his hairpiece. So sometimes you'll see him in movies where he has big bouffant of hair going on, and it's just a hairpiece. Whereas you see him in certain other films where he's au naturel, so to speak. So House of Long Shadows, for example, we mentioned before, he's not augmented with anything there. You can see where his hairline was really at. So he was always he was always doing that sort of gesture of smoothing down the hair and so forth, maybe sometimes making sure that it was still there. I mean, he was very mannered, very fussy in some respects. There were times when that could get a little carried away. Maybe he needed to be sort of reined in ever so slightly. But he was a very, very versatile actor, an extremely gifted actor who, unfortunately, if you look at his filmography, from the beginning to the end, I think one of the reasons he was only too happy to stick with horror films after a certain point anyway was he realized that they were giving him better parts. Because most of the other films that he did outside of the horror genre, and I'm talking about films, I'm not talking theater or television, he had great opportunities in both of those. Although he didn't like doing theater very much, he didn't like the repetitious aspect of it. But in terms of films, he didn't get very good film roles other than his horror films for the most part. Like he's in some good movies, Time Without Pity, a Joseph Losey noir that he's in. He doesn't have a very good part in it. And a lot of other things as well, with the exception of some things like Cash on Demand, Cone of Silence, and Suspect that we mentioned before. Those were really good parts. But for the most part, his real opportunities to shine came in these horror films. And, obviously made the very best of it and delivered some really fantastic performances. I mean, again, it's Baron Frankenstein, but also on the other side of the coin, Dr. Van Helsing in various Hammer films as well. And, sometimes even just really adding a lot to characters that didn't have a lot on the page. I mean, if you look at a movie like The Mummy, there's not really a lot for him on the page, I don't think. But he really brings that character to life and does a lot with it. So, again, or a film like The Skull, which really rests heavily on his shoulders because so much of that movie is just following him around. It's a very thin movie in terms of plot, but the mood, the atmosphere is really fantastic. And Cushing does a beautiful job of carrying it.
Are there, we'll say, like two deep cuts that maybe we've either mentioned or haven't mentioned at all, but something that, most of us have probably never seen that you would say, these are absolutely worth your time checking out. Even if you look at a couple of his biggest titles, these are like the second wave of you absolutely should follow up with a couple more.
It's hard to say. I mean, deep cut, I don't know. There's certainly films that aren't as popular, or performances, I should say, that don't get talked about as much. But I wouldn't say that they're films that aren't very well known. I mean, I think a really, really interesting performance of his is in Asylum, which is one of the Amicus anthologies he did. This was during this period, and Rigby talks about this in his book as well, this period of really intense, nakedly emotional performance he was giving after his wife died. Really, like, sometimes playing extremes of emotions. And in this character's case, he's playing a man who's grieving. So he's bringing a lot of that grief that he's feeling in his real life to the character. And it's a really oddly affecting performance in a segment that's not always spoken of terribly well. It's called The Weird Tailor, where he commissions Barry Morse to make a suit out of this very unusual fabric, and it turns out that it's to be used to bring his dead son back to life. Spoiler alert, but the movie is over 50 years old. It's a lovely performance from him in that. In terms of, I mean, on a different end of the spectrum, in terms of playing, again, just a really nasty character. It's not that it's an unknown film. I think it's fairly popular among people who like these films, but Twins of Evil, where he plays a fanatical witch hunter who is extremely unsympathetic. And again, it's always funny to me, again, because people love Cushing so much, and for obvious reasons. I mean, there was a great warmth to it, and a great warmth to him, and a great humanity to him. But let's not confuse the actor with the roles, and vice versa. He was capable of playing really nasty, unpleasant characters, and I don't think it's necessary always to sort of say, "Oh, but he was doing it for a good." No, he wasn't. No, this was a pretty nasty character. So I like seeing him in something like that. Or Corruption, I mentioned before, is another one. I mean, it's not a movie I'm that crazy about, but boy, is he good in it.
I would agree there. That's a fun one for him. The Severin set, it is, by all accounts, everybody seems to be raving about it. I cannot wait to have it. I'm so glad that you wanted to advocate for it. And again, Rigby and Lyons clearly put their all into the set. They're such a huge part of it. And for Severin to bring, we were just talking about deep cuts. Some of those are very deep cuts, and just to get them out there for people to be able to see, not to mention the rescued episodes. I mean, that's a big deal. A lot of these would never get a chance with any other label. So Severin just once again delivering things that are, I mean, to be fair, a lot of those are kind of risky, and especially to put them in a bit of an expensive package. I really hope some people discover those and go all in on them, because they do incredible work. So, I mean, really, Troy, just thank you for wanting to talk about Cushing. He's not somebody that gets a ton of love, and it's perfect time after what Severin did. So glad you suggested him.
Yeah, I mean, again, he's one of my favorites. Has been literally for as long as I can remember, and always a pleasure to get a chance to talk about him. As many commentaries as I've done, I think I've only done one film that he was in, and that's The House that Dripped Blood. Which is, obviously a movie I love, and have a great deal of affection for. But yeah, I mean, he's somebody I never tire of watching, and it's interesting. Pop culture has a very short memory. It's true to say that, even big iconic actors and so forth that you would think most younger people and just the average person on the street, they probably don't even know who Humphrey Bogart is.
Yep.
To be honest, they probably don't. They probably don't know who Edward G. Robinson is. A lot of these people, they certainly don't know who Peter Cushing is. And if they do, they know him as the old guy in Star Wars, which to an extent is what probably a lot of people would say about Christopher Lee now as well. They know him for battling Yoda in one of the later Star Wars movies, or for being Saruman in Lord of the Rings. I mean, Lee was fortunate that he had this fantastic last act after a pretty grim period in the 80s and 90s where he wasn't always getting great films. So he had a great renaissance at the end. I think Cushing could have had something similar had his health been better. But unfortunately, after doing what became his last theatrical big screen film, a movie called Biggles Adventures in Time, around about 1985, he was diagnosed with cancer, and his health became too precarious for him to be insured. So he wanted to work. He kept, he was actually, I mentioned Jeremy Brett before. He was going to do one of the episodes of the Sherlock Holmes series that Jeremy Brett did called The Last Vampire. He ended up not being able to do it due to ill health. So, there you go. Unfortunately, he didn't have an opportunity to continue on acting into the 1990s. And I can still remember it very vividly when he passed away. It was, certain celebrity deaths hit you in a certain way. Cushing, Pleasance, Christopher Lee, obviously, and a few others definitely hit me hard, because these were people I grew up really, really admiring, and almost in a weird sort of way, they almost sort of felt like family to me growing up, because they were just always there. Yeah. Vincent Price, another one, big one. When Vincent Price died in '93, I was really terribly depressed. And I didn't know these people. I didn't meet them, although I did manage to get Peter Cushing's autograph. I sent away, and he sent it to me not long before he died. So, I mean, that's something.
That's really cool. That's awesome. I don't always do this, but I gotta ask, you got any book work happening? Is there anything else that you can hint that you got coming up anytime soon?
No, I mean, I can talk about a couple of things because I've already announced them. We talked before about Eugenio Ercolani. He and I are working on a potential series. We're planning to make, at least a few volumes of these. It's called Unsung Heroes, which are going to focus on Italian filmmakers whose output wasn't especially prolific. So we're writing about 4 different directors, 2 and 2. He's writing about his grandfather, Giulio Petroni, and a director named Franco Rossetti. I'm writing about Massimo Dallamano and Vittorio Salerno. These are not household names, but it would be difficult to write a book about any of these people, just them, because Massimo Dallamano, for example, only directed 11 features. So that's difficult to sustain into a book. But if you put them all together, that's kind of the idea. So that's being worked on. I've written a book which is in the process of being edited about the German director Robert Siegel. Nice. He made a film called Lorien, which, if you haven't seen, I highly recommend. It's a really beautiful film. Really, I think one of the best German horror films ever made. And he's not had the career that he really deserved in many respects, but he's done some other interesting stuff. So, working with him, interviewing him very extensively and so forth, I've done this book, and I'm planning a book on the Italian director Alberto De Martino, who you may not be familiar with, but directed things like Blazing Magnum with Stuart Whitman and John Saxon, and The Antichrist with Mel Ferrer and Arthur Kennedy, and Holocaust 2000 with Kirk Douglas. So, yeah, I got that coming as well.
Interesting. And then, I mean, fairly recently, you just put out your last one. Was it last or not? It was 2022, or was that 2023? Time is blurred so much.
Time is blurred for me altogether. I'm lucky. I believe it was 2022 that Make Them Die Slowly came out, which is Umberto Lenzi, which, I was very, very pleased with the way that turned out. And I can talk about it here. I mean, I have no reason not to. I haven't announced it yet, but it's been a decade since I did the So Deadly, So Perverse books, which turned into a trilogy. It wasn't always intended to be that way, but all these years later, I'm mulling over the idea of doing another book, not part of that series, but another kind of a broader overview of the Giallo, not an encyclopedia type thing, but more kind of examining different trends and different styles of the films, and assembling it slightly differently. So that's something I'm thinking about doing as well. Hopefully that's not going back to the same well too often, but I think it's been enough time.
Well, I mean, after looking at the Make Them Die Slowly, I have to admit, and would say this to anybody, it's not just because you're here or anything. You're clearly just getting better and better with time. That book is astonishing, and it's one that people should be looking up. It's incredible. I had Troy on right around when it was coming out, and go back and watch that conversation. It's an incredible piece, and Lenzi keeps getting a lot of love on home video lately. So people that are falling for Lenzi, this is a good time to go pick up a supplemental piece, fulfill some of that context around some of these films, and just if you've enjoyed Troy for the last hour talking about Peter Cushing, there's a lot with Troy's work that you can dive into, from commentaries and books and lots of things to support Troy. So please go do that. I've enjoyed your work immensely. So it's an honor to have you here again tonight, sir.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you said I'm getting better and better and not worse and worse. Although some might disagree. But yes, no, I appreciate it. And there's more Lenzi coming, by the way, as far as upgrades and things are concerned. I can't tell you what or from whom, but there is more coming.
That is not surprising. I'm really glad that that's happening. Troy and everybody that's been hanging out tonight, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Craig from Deaf Crocodile, he wants you to repeat that German film that you were talking about.
It's called Laurin, Laurin. It's from the 1980s. It was released in '89. There is a British Blu-ray at this point from Second Run. It's a really, really fine film. Lots of influences from many interesting sources. Heavy Polanski influence, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he's somebody we'll talk about someday if the public is prepared.
we will try to get the public prepared. Again, everybody go check out Troy's stuff. Thanks for your time hanging out tonight. We will see you next Thursday. Troy, if you'll come back, I would be thrilled to have you back soon.
Just ask me. I'm not hard to get a hold of.
Have a good one, everybody. We'll see you next week. Thank you for watching The Disconnected. On the way out, make sure that you are subscribed to the channel, that you've liked the video, and that you've copied the link to be able to share with someone else that may appreciate this.